Rain pounded against the hospital windows as a woman's voice echoed down the corridor, sharp, broken, and filled with something close to fear. "This isn't my baby. What did you do to me?" Nurses froze. Doctors exchanged uneasy glances, and for a moment no one moved, because whatever had just happened inside that room was not part of any normal delivery, not part of any agreement, and certainly not something written in the contract she had signed months earlier. The same contract that promised safety, compensation, and control. The same contract that was supposed to protect everyone involved, especially her. But now, as she lay there trembling and confused, those promises felt distant, almost meaningless, because something had gone wrong in a way no one was prepared to explain, and the silence from the people around her only made it worse, as if they knew something she didn't, something they were not ready to say out loud, something that would change everything she believed about the decision that brought her there in the first place. She had signed a legal agreement, a carefully structured document filled with clauses, conditions, and guarantees, agreeing to carry a child for a man she had only met twice, a man whose name carried weight in financial circles, a man who was known for control, precision, and getting exactly what he wanted every single time. Everything about the arrangement was documented, verified, and approved. From the medical procedures to the living conditions, from the payments to the timelines, nothing was supposed to be uncertain, nothing was supposed to be left to chance. And yet, somehow, everything had led to this moment, to a hospital room filled with tension and unanswered questions, to a woman staring at a child she no longer recognized as part of the agreement she had made, to a reality that no longer aligned with what she had been told from the very beginning. Because what she discovered in that moment was not just a simple misunderstanding, not a minor complication, and not an unfortunate accident that could be explained away with medical terms and legal language. It was something far more deliberate, something that suggested planning, intention, and a level of control that extended far beyond what she had agreed to. And the more she tried to make sense of it, the clearer it became that this situation had been shaped long before she ever signed her name on that contract. Long before she stepped into that building, long before she believed she had a choice. And as the weight of that realization began to settle in, one question started to form, quiet at first but impossible to ignore. If everything had been controlled from the start, then what exactly had she been chosen for? And why her? Because answers like that do not appear by accident, and whatever the truth was, it had been waiting for her from the very beginning, hidden in plain sight, carefully placed where she would never think to look until it was too late to turn back. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. At first, it looked like a simple agreement, the kind of arrangement that happens quietly every day, signed in offices, approved by lawyers, and carried out behind closed doors without ever reaching public attention. A legal exchange between two adults who both stood to gain something from it. Maya needed money, more than she had ever needed anything in her life, and Adrien Cole had the resources to solve that problem instantly. The kind of man who didn't wait for opportunities but created them, who didn't rely on chance but built outcomes step by step. And when their paths crossed, it seemed almost logical, almost inevitable, that a deal would be made, one that promised stability for her and something far more personal for him. Something he had kept out of the public eye for years, a desire that no headline had ever fully explained. And yet, despite how straightforward it all appeared on paper, there were details that didn't quite sit right. Details that felt small at first but grew heavier the more they were examined. Maya was not careless. She was not someone who rushed into decisions without thinking. In fact, everything about her life had taught her to question, to double-check, to survive by noticing what others ignored. And that was exactly what made this situation so difficult to understand. Because she had read the contract more than once, she had asked questions, she had listened carefully during every meeting, and still, there were things she couldn't fully explain even before everything fell apart. Like why she had been chosen so quickly out of so many potential candidates, why Adrien's team had moved with such urgency, as if time itself was a factor they couldn't afford to waste, and why certain parts of the agreement were protected with layers of confidentiality that went far beyond what was considered normal. Even in high-profile arrangements like this, it was all legal, all documented, all approved. But legality does not always equal clarity, and clarity was exactly what was missing. Adrien Cole was not a man known for randomness. Every decision tied back to a purpose. Every move connected to a larger plan. And people who worked with him often described him as someone who calculated outcomes long before anyone else even recognized the situation. Which is why his involvement in something so deeply personal raised questions that didn't have easy answers. Because if he had access to the best medical experts, the most advanced facilities, and the widest range of options, then why? Maya? Why someone with no connection to his world, no visible link to his past, and no reason to stand out among countless others who could have fulfilled the same role? Unless there was something about her that wasn't obvious at first glance, something that didn't appear in the documents or the interviews, but existed somewhere deeper, something that made her not just suitable, but necessary. And then there was the secrecy, not the standard discretion that comes with wealth and privacy, but something tighter, something more controlled, communication filtered, movements monitored, information restricted to only what was deemed necessary, as if the process itself required isolation to function properly, as if too much visibility could disrupt whatever was being put into motion. And for Maya, that silence slowly turned into something harder to ignore, because questions that are not answered don't disappear. They grow, they expand, they settle in the back of the mind until they demand attention. And the most unsettling question of all was the one she couldn't yet put into words, the one that lingered just beneath the surface of everything she had agreed to. If the contract defined every step of the process, then why did it feel like the most important part had been left out? Why did it feel like something had been decided for her long before she ever signed her name? And, most importantly, what exactly had been placed inside her? Because whatever it was, it carried answers that no one around her seemed willing to give. And the deeper we look into this case, the clearer it becomes that this was never just a simple agreement. It was something far more complex, something carefully arranged, and something that stopped making sense the moment you tried to see it clearly. Long before the contract, before the hospital, before the questions that would later refuse to leave her mind, Maya Johnson's life had already been shaped by pressure most people spend years trying to avoid. She was not careless with her decisions, and she was not someone waiting to be rescued. She had built her routine around survival with a level of discipline that left little room for mistakes. Waking before sunrise, working long shifts that stretched her energy thin, and still finding ways to manage responsibilities that would overwhelm someone twice as resourced. Her father's condition had turned into a constant financial drain, the kind that doesn't come all at once but accumulates quietly, appointment after appointment, bill after bill, until it becomes something that follows you everywhere. Her family depended on her not just emotionally, but practically. And that responsibility had sharpened her instincts. She paid attention, she noticed patterns, and she understood risk in a way that came from experience rather than theory, which is exactly why what happened next stands out. Because people like Maya don't walk into situations blindly. They calculate, they question, and they prepare. And yet, despite all of that, she found herself stepping into something that would eventually challenge everything she thought she understood about control. Adrien Cole existed on the opposite end of that reality. His world was built on certainty, not survival, on influence rather than reaction. He was known in business circles as someone who did not tolerate unpredictability, someone who structured outcomes with a level of precision that made even high-risk ventures feel controlled. His companies operated across multiple industries, each one reflecting the same approach, calculated, efficient, and carefully insulated from unnecessary exposure. He rarely gave interviews, rarely appeared in public without purpose, and maintained a level of privacy that only added to the perception that everything in his life was intentional. There were no public relationships, no scandals, no visible personal attachments, and most notably, no heirs, which for a man of his status raised quiet questions that were never fully addressed. Because in environments where legacy matters, absence becomes noticeable, and for a man who controlled nearly every aspect of his life, the lack of something so fundamental suggested not oversight, but choice, or perhaps a delay, a decision waiting for the right conditions to be met. Because for someone like Adrien Cole, nothing significant happens without timing, and timing, in his world, is never accidental. Their first encounter did not look like the beginning of anything planned. It looked like an interruption, a moment shaped by circumstance rather than design. Maya had been moving through the city with the same focus she carried every day, managing time, conserving energy, thinking ahead, but the strain of everything she was carrying, physically and mentally, had been building in ways even she could not fully measure. And when it finally caught up with her, it happened in a place that could not have been more unexpected, right outside the headquarters of Cole Enterprises, a building that reflected the scale of the man who owned it, structured, polished, and distant from the kind of life she was used to navigating. When she stumbled and collapsed, it was not part of any plan, not something she could control or anticipate, and yet it placed her directly in front of someone whose presence alone changed the direction of the moment, because Adrien Cole was not known for stepping into situations like that. He was not someone who reacted without purpose, and yet he did, moving forward before anyone else, catching her before she hit the ground. And in that brief moment, something shifted, not visibly, not in a way that could be immediately understood, but in a way that would later connect back to everything that followed. What stands out in that encounter is not just that he helped her, but how he looked at her, not with confusion or concern alone, but with a level of focus that suggests recognition, as if he was seeing more than what was in front of him, as if the situation itself was being processed differently in his mind. And while to anyone else it might have seemed like a simple act of assistance, a moment that would end as quickly as it began, for Adrien Cole, moments like that are rarely isolated. They fit into patterns, into decisions that extend beyond what is immediately visible. And for Maya, who regained consciousness without fully understanding how she had ended up there, it felt like an interruption in her day, something unexpected but temporary, something she could move past and continue from. But certain events do not end when they appear to, they carry forward, quietly connecting to outcomes that only make sense later. And this was one of those moments, because within 48 hours, the situation would evolve in a way that could not be explained by coincidence alone. An offer would be presented, precise, immediate, and difficult to ignore, and the speed at which it arrived would raise a question that would not have an answer at the time, but would become impossible to dismiss later, because when something moves that quickly, especially in a world defined by calculation, it is rarely random, and within 48 hours, Maya Johnson would find herself facing a decision that didn't feel like a coincidence. Within 48 hours of collapsing outside Cole Enterprises, Maya Johnson received a call that did not feel like follow-up or courtesy. It felt arranged, precise, and already in motion. She was asked to come to a private office, not the main building lobby she had seen before, but a quieter location, controlled, minimal, the kind of place where conversations do not leave the room. And before anything was explained, before any offer was even mentioned, a document was placed in front of her. A non-disclosure agreement, detailed, firm, and non-negotiable. She read it carefully, line by line, because that was who she was, someone who understood that decisions made in rooms like that often carried consequences long after the moment had passed. And once she signed, the tone of the meeting shifted, not dramatically, but enough to make it clear that what came next had been waiting on that signature. And when Adrien Cole finally spoke, it was direct, controlled, and without hesitation. He explained that he wanted her to carry his child, not as a favor, not as an emotional request, but as a structured agreement, one that would compensate her more than she could earn in years, enough to clear her debts, stabilize her family, and change the direction of her life in ways she had not been able to achieve on her own. And for a moment, the simplicity of it all almost made sense, because problems that take years to solve can sometimes be reduced to a single decision when the right resources are involved. But simplicity rarely holds when examined closely, and as the details unfolded, the conditions began to take shape in ways that were harder to ignore. There would be no contact after the birth, no updates, no future involvement of any kind. The child would not be part of her life beyond the agreement. Medical access would be limited to specific facilities chosen by Adrien's team, all appointments monitored, all information filtered through channels she could not fully control, and perhaps most notably, she would be required to stay in a residence provided by him for the duration of the pregnancy, a place designed for comfort but structured around observation, movement tracked, interactions limited, everything framed as protection, as care, as necessity. And yet, beneath those explanations, There was a level of restriction that did not align with what she had expected, not entirely. Not in a way she could easily explain, but enough to create hesitation, because when control is presented as support, the difference can be difficult to define until it becomes something you cannot step away from. Maya did not respond immediately. She asked questions, she took time, she revisited the contract more than once, and every time she looked at it, the same conflict returned. On one side, the opportunity to solve problems that had been building for years, her father's treatment, her family's stability, the pressure that followed her every day, and on the other side, a situation that, while legal and structured, carried uncertainties she could not fully resolve. And as she weighed those factors, reality pressed in from all directions, calls from home, reminders of bills that could not wait, the quiet understanding that doing nothing would not change anything, and that sometimes choices are not made because they feel right, but because the alternative feels impossible. And in that space, between caution and necessity, the decision began to shift, not suddenly, but steadily, until hesitation gave way to acceptance, not because every question had been answered, but because the outcome seemed too significant to ignore. When she signed, it was not with excitement, not with relief, but with a controlled understanding of what she was agreeing to, or at least what she believed she was agreeing to at the time, because in that moment, the contract represented a solution, a way forward, a structured path out of a situation that had no easy exits. And as the process began, everything moved quickly, efficiently, without unnecessary delays. Appointments scheduled, preparations made, transitions handled with a level of coordination that reflected Adrien Cole's approach to everything he was involved in. And as she was brought into the medical phase of the agreement, the environment shifted, less personal, more clinical, rooms designed for precision rather than comfort, conversations focused on procedure rather than reassurance, and throughout it all, a consistent absence of warmth, not hostility, but a kind of detachment that made it clear this was not about emotion, it was about execution, about achieving a specific outcome with as little deviation as possible. The procedure itself was handled with the same level of control, explained in terms that emphasized process over meaning, steps over implications, and while Maya followed everything carefully, trusting the structure she had agreed to, there was a growing awareness that she was moving through something she did not fully understand, not because information was missing, but because certain parts of it felt incomplete, like pieces of a larger picture that had not been shown to her. And as the days passed and the initial stages settled, something began to surface, not immediately alarming, but unusual enough to stand out, a detail in her medical results that did not align with what she had been told to expect, something small on its own, but significant when placed in context. And it was at that point, before any clear explanation was given, before any concern was officially acknowledged, that a new question began to take shape, one that would not stay contained for long, because whatever had appeared in those results was not part of the agreement she had signed. And once something like that enters a situation built on control, it changes everything, because control depends on predictability, and what she was seeing did not feel predictable at all. What followed the procedure did not begin with anything dramatic. There were no immediate alarms, no clear signs that something had gone wrong. Only small changes that could easily be explained away if viewed in isolation. Maya noticed shifts in how her body responded, symptoms that did not match what she had been briefed on, patterns that felt slightly off, but not extreme enough to raise formal concern. And when she asked questions, the answers came quickly but without depth, controlled. Responses that addressed the surface without expanding into detail. And over time, those responses began to repeat, not in wording, but in structure, always enough to move forward, never enough to fully understand. And it was in that repetition that the first layer of doubt began to form. Because when information is managed too carefully, it starts to feel less like guidance and more like restriction. And for someone like Maya, who had learned to rely on clarity to make decisions, that absence became difficult to ignore, especially when it was paired with a growing sense that her access to her own condition was being filtered through a system she did not control. The symptoms continued, subtle but persistent, and with each appointment, the same pattern followed: data collected, results reviewed, conclusions delivered without room for deeper discussion. And while everything remained within what could technically be considered normal, the consistency of that structure raised questions that could not be answered within the environment she was placed in. So she began to look beyond it, quietly, carefully, using the same instincts that had helped her navigate every difficult situation in her life. She started tracking timelines, comparing dates, revisiting documents she had already signed, and what she found did not immediately point to a single explanation, but it introduced inconsistencies that should not have existed in a process built on precision, timelines that did not align exactly with the procedure she underwent, gaps in records that should have been complete, and small discrepancies in identification markers that suggested information had been adjusted or replaced, not entirely removed, but altered just enough to avoid drawing attention unless someone was actively looking for it. And as those pieces began to come together, the situation shifted from uncertainty to suspicion, because isolated errors can happen, but structured inconsistencies tend to follow intention. Maya's investigation remained quiet, not out of fear, but out of awareness. She understood that the environment she was in was designed to monitor, to observe, and potentially to limit actions that fell outside expected behavior. So she moved carefully, gathering what she could without disrupting the structure around her. And as she did, the picture became more complex, not clearer, because every answer seemed to introduce another question, and the deeper she went, the more it felt like the information available to her had been curated, not fabricated entirely, but arranged in a way that guided perception without revealing the full context. And it was at that point that she realized she needed perspective from outside the system, from someone who had seen it from the inside but was no longer part of it. That opportunity came unexpectedly, through a contact she would not have recognized as significant before all of this began. A former employee connected to Adrien Cole's operations, someone who had worked within the structure long enough to understand how decisions were made and how information was handled. And while their initial conversation remained cautious, limited in detail, one statement stood out clearly, not because of how it was said, but because of what it implied. This isn't the first time. And with that, the situation expanded beyond Maya's personal experience into something broader, something that suggested repetition, process, and a level of consistency that could not be dismissed as coincidence. And that statement was later reinforced by a second source, a medical professional who had indirect exposure to similar cases, someone who could not confirm specifics but recognized patterns. Patterns that aligned too closely with what Maya was beginning to uncover. As those perspectives settled in, new possibilities began to surface, explanations that at first seemed extreme but could not be immediately ruled out given the inconsistencies already present, questions about whether this was an advanced form of genetic experimentation, whether the procedure involved more than standard surrogacy protocols, whether identity factors had been manipulated at a level that extended beyond what was disclosed. And while none of these possibilities could be confirmed, with the information she had at the time, their existence alone shifted the way she viewed everything she had agreed to. Because when multiple explanations remain plausible, the absence of clarity becomes its own form of evidence. And as that realization took hold, one conclusion became increasingly difficult to avoid. She had not been selected at random, not based on availability or convenience, but for a reason that had been defined long before she entered the process, a reason that connected to details she had not yet fully uncovered. And as she continued to follow that line of thought, one final discovery began to take shape, something that would move the situation from suspicion into certainty, because what she found next made one thing clear: this child was never meant to be hers or his. By the time Maya Johnson reached the final stage of her quiet investigation, the fragments she had gathered no longer felt disconnected. They began to align in a way that pointed toward a single, unavoidable conclusion, one that carried more weight than anything she had considered before. Because the inconsistencies were no longer just errors or omissions, they formed a pattern, and patterns like that rarely exist without purpose. It started with the genetic reports she was never meant to fully interpret, data presented in controlled summaries but detailed enough, if examined closely, to reveal something far more significant. Markers that should have belonged to a donor profile instead mirrored her own, not completely, not in a way that was immediately obvious, but with enough overlap to raise a question that could not be dismissed. And when she cross-referenced those findings with the altered records she had already uncovered, the answer became clear in a way that removed any remaining doubt. The pregnancy she had agreed to was not based on an external donor in the way she had been told. Her own genetic material had been used, without her consent, without her knowledge, integrated into a process that had been presented to her as standard but was anything but. And in that moment, the agreement she thought she understood collapsed entirely, replaced by a reality that had been constructed around her rather than shared with her. The implications of that discovery extended beyond personal betrayal. They pointed to a level of planning that could not be explained by convenience or necessity alone. Because if her DNA had been selected intentionally, then the question was not just how it had been used, but why it had been chosen in the first place. And as she followed that line of thought further, another layer revealed itself. One that connected Adrien Cole to a past he had kept almost entirely out of public view. Fragmented records, references that had been buried in older data archives, and indirect mentions of a person whose existence had never been widely acknowledged, someone who, based on what little information remained, shared genetic similarities with Maya in ways that could not be easily dismissed as coincidence. And it was in that connection that the broader objective began to take shape. Because this was not about creating an heir in the conventional sense, it was about recreating something that had already existed, not identically, not perfectly, but closely enough to satisfy a purpose that had never been openly stated. And when viewed through that lens, every decision, every restriction, every carefully managed detail fell into place, not as isolated choices, but as components of a process designed to produce a specific outcome. For Maya, the realization carried both emotional and logical weight. It was not just that she had been misled, it was that her role in the situation had been defined long before she was aware of it. Her involvement reduced to a function within a larger plan that operated independently of her understanding. And that level of control, of deliberate omission, transformed the agreement into something far more serious than a contractual arrangement. It became an ethical violation, a misuse of access, a demonstration of how influence and resources can reshape boundaries that are supposed to remain fixed. And as that understanding settled in, the need for confrontation became unavoidable, not out of impulse, but out of necessity, because answers of that magnitude cannot remain unaddressed without consequence. When Maya finally stood across from Adrien Cole again, the setting was as controlled as everything else he had been involved in, composed, measured, absent of any visible disruption. And yet the tension between them carried everything that had been uncovered. She did not approach the conversation with uncertainty. She approached it with clarity, the kind that comes from piecing together information that was never meant to be seen as a whole. And when she spoke, her words reflected that. Understanding, direct, precise, and without hesitation. You didn't choose me by accident, did you? The question was not framed as speculation. It was a statement seeking confirmation, and Adrien's response matched the tone he had maintained from the beginning, controlled, deliberate, and stripped of unnecessary explanation. Nothing about this was accidental, and in that exchange, the final confirmation was given, not through detail, but through acknowledgement, because sometimes the absence of denial carries more weight than any explanation. And with that, the truth that had been built in fragments was fully realized, leaving behind a reality that could no longer be interpreted as anything other than intentional. What happened next did not unfold in a way that offered immediate clarity or resolution, because situations built on control rarely collapse all at once. They shift, they tighten, they adapt. And for Maya Johnson, the realization of what had been done to her marked the beginning of a different kind of decision, one that no longer centered on survival or opportunity, but on consequence. Because exposing something like this meant stepping into a system that was designed to protect itself. A system backed by influence, resources, and layers of insulation that do not easily break under pressure. And yet, remaining silent meant accepting a reality that had been constructed without her consent, allowing it to continue beyond her own experience. And that was not something she could reconcile with what she now understood. So she moved carefully, not impulsively, gathering what she had, securing the fragments of evidence that connected the process from beginning to end, knowing that what she held was not just personal proof, but a structure that could reveal how everything had been arranged. The process of bringing that information forward did not happen overnight. It required navigation through channels that were not built for transparency, conversations with individuals who understood the risks involved, and a level of persistence that mirrored the precision of the system she was challenging. And while parts of what she uncovered began to surface, enough to raise questions, enough to draw attention from those willing to look deeper, the full scope of the situation never settled into a single, publicly confirmed narrative. Some elements were acknowledged, others were dismissed, and certain aspects simply disappeared from the records that once held them, leaving behind a version of events that felt incomplete, as if the truth existed in pieces rather than as a whole. And for those trying to follow the case from the outside, that fragmentation made it difficult to determine where the line between fact and control had been drawn, because when information is shaped by those with the ability to influence its release, clarity becomes something that can be adjusted rather than revealed. Adrien Cole did not make public statements. He did not engage with the questions that emerged, and his operations continued with the same level of structure and discretion that had defined them from the beginning. And in that continuation, there was no visible acknowledgement of disruption, no indication that anything within his system had been altered by what had taken place, which in itself raised a different kind of question, not about what had happened, but about what could continue to happen under the same conditions. Because when a structure remains intact after being challenged, it suggests that its foundation was never dependent on external perception to begin with. And for Maya, that reality became part of the outcome she had to live with, not as a conclusion, but as an understanding, one that did not provide complete closure, but did redefine the way she viewed the decision that had brought her into it. And perhaps that is where this story ultimately settles, not in a clear ending, but in a space where interpretation becomes part of the experience. Because in a world where power can influence science, where agreements can redefine boundaries that were once considered fixed, and where information can be controlled as carefully as the processes it describes, the question is no longer limited to what happened in a single case. It extends beyond that, into the systems that allow something like this to exist in the first place. And in that context, the real question is not simply what happened to Maya Johnson. It is something more personal, something that shifts the focus back to the individual. Because faced with the same circumstances, the same pressures, and the same promise of a solution that seems impossible to ignore, the decision might not feel as distant as it appears from the outside. And that leads to a final question that does not have a simple answer. If you were in her position, would you have signed the contract? And now that you've heard everything, from the moment Maya Johnson collapsed outside Cole Enterprises to the truth she uncovered inside a system built on control, the story no longer belongs to just one perspective. It opens up to interpretation, to judgment, to the kind of reflection that doesn't come with a single correct answer. Because what happened in that controlled environment raises questions that go beyond contracts and medical procedures. It challenges how far influence can extend when no one is looking closely enough, and whether decisions made under pressure can ever truly be considered free. So take a moment and think about it carefully. What do you believe really happened behind those doors? Was this a calculated process that crossed a line that should never be crossed? Or was it something more complex, shaped by intentions that were never fully explained? And more importantly, where do you stand on Adrien Cole? Do you see his actions as justified within the structure he created? Or do you see something far more dangerous in the way everything was carried out? Because perspectives on stories like this often reveal as much about us as they do about the people involved. Let us know what you think in the comments. Share your perspective, your interpretation, and the moment in the story that stood out to you the most. Because discussions like this are what bring these stories to life beyond the narration. And if you've made it this far, make sure to like the video and hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming stories. Because each one explores a different side of decisions, consequences, and the systems that shape them. And if you think this story was shocking, the next one is even more disturbing, and you won't want to miss it.